Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us From Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us From Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
Because it acknowledges the equal rights and dignity of all people, runs afoul of the Trump administration, which has made its calling card the idea that not everybody has the same rights.
Welcome to Save Us From Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I'm your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I've covered the United Nations as a journalist for 21 years at this point, now that we're in 2025. Something around there. At least 2 decades, since Kofi Annan was a Secretary General.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, and I write and I teach and I do research about the United Nations, and my mother says I'm no longer allowed to tell people how long I've been doing something because then they know how old she is.
So, Anjali, one of my favorite movies of all time does not have anything to do with the United Nations. Shawshank Redemption. A famous line delivered by Morgan Freeman to Tim Robbins is, "Hope, Andy, is a very dangerous thing." How are you feeling about hope these days, Anjali?
Well, I think as a person, hope is the vital thing that keeps us going during important times, right? So the abolitionist thinker Mariam Kaba says hope is a discipline, something that you show up to do again and again and again. It's a tool to change the world. The feminist writer Rebecca Solnit says hope is an axe. It's not a lottery ticket. It's what you use to beat down the doors that stand between you and a better future. But the U.S. mission to the United Nations thinks hope is an unnecessary part of our lives. Earlier this week, the United States became the only country in the world to vote against establishing an International Day of Hope. It was a plan put forth by Karabati. For explicable reasons, it had widespread support across the world. Every other member state either voted for it or a very small number, 2 or 3, abstained. I don't know why they abstained, but I do know that the U.S. laid out its reasons very clearly for voting against hope. And it's almost a little too on the nose, right? Like if this was the first draft of like a West Wing style show, someone would be like, that's a little on the nose, right? Like, I don't know, you're sort of over-egging the pudding here. But the U.S. says, essentially, according to its statement, that there are too many international days. And the draft resolution on hope also contains reference to diversity, equity, and inclusion that conflict with U.S. policies that seek to eliminate all forms of discrimination and create equal opportunities for all. It's a vote that says, and I quote, "This resolution, however, contributes to the unnecessary proliferation of multiple international days, many of which have similar intent, including UNGA Resolution 3637 of November 1981, declaring an International Day of Peace, UNGA Resolution 66281 of June 2012 on the International Day of Happiness, and UNGA Resolution of 72130 of December 2017, declaring the International Day of Living Together in Peace." So the U.S. mission to the United Nations would like us to know that we do not need hope because we already have resolutions about peace, happiness, and living together in peace. So what more could we possibly want?
So this anecdote to me is yet another piece of evidence that I'm gathering to advance a theory that I've written about in a recent edition of the Global Dispatch's newsletter, that opposing DEI has become the prime directive of the Trump administration at the United Nations, that they are willing to go to the bowels of the bureaucracy to oppose certain language in various UN forum that has anything close to DEI, and we'll get into that in a second when we talk about the Commission on the Status of Women, that they are willing to be the only country in the world to vote against a resolution at the General Assembly that obliges them of nothing.
Yeah.
Again, suggests to me that the United Nations is a battleground for Trump's battle on DEI. It is the key political issue here in the United States, and they are willing and able and eager to use the United Nations as a platform to advance this political agenda. And accordingly, fighting DEI, everything flows from that at the United Nations these days for the Trump administration.
That's right. And this is really an extreme case where you see it at work, right? These international days, by the U.S. missions to the United Nations' own admission, don't cost anybody anything. They note, we recognize that any costs that arise from implementation of this resolution be voluntary. However, in a world that faces many challenges, funding and effort should be allocated to critical causes and crises rather than to international days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be honest, I don't have a breakdown of the cost of international days. It must be negligible.
You should have one of like a PhD student of yours or an undergrad student write a paper on that. I would read it eagerly.
If you are a PhD student listening to this and you want to do this, please get in touch because I would be curious to know. I assume that they are costless, right? So this is basically the political equivalent of taking soft diplomatic capital and burning it on the lawn for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It's setting yourself up in opposition to a group of people who would like to adopt an International Day of Hope. I should note, though, this was on March 4th. The U.S. went on a full-scale rampage of voting against things at the General Assembly. They voted against Nauru's judicial well-being resolution. They voted against Mongolia's education for democracy. They voted against establishing a UN Regional Center for Sustainable Development Goals for Central Asia and Afghanistan and Kazakhstan. They voted against, of course, the International Day of Hope, and they removed themselves from the paragraph that acknowledges decolonization in a resolution acknowledging the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So,
yeah, I mean, it's just worth emphasizing the point, the serious point that you made before, which is this is burning diplomatic capital for no reason. I mean, look, these resolutions are not super serious, right?
Yeah.
But some countries do take them very seriously. They spend energy putting these things together, and it's like costless to support them, but costly to oppose them. And there's no real reason to oppose it. Like, why are you picking a fight with Mongolia, right? Don't you want to be on Mongolia's side in your geopolitical competition with China? Meh, apparently it doesn't matter.
Who's going out of their way to pick a fight with Kiribati when you're the United States of America? What possible... I guess we should separate two things. The first is we should separate these things are not very serious from these things are not binding and not costly.
Mm-hmm.
When we say they're not binding and they're not costly, I mean, General Assembly resolutions do not have the force of international law. What they do is they represent international consensus. They're a way for us to get a sense of like the temperature of the world, where it's leaning, what the sort of big ideas about foreign policy, about norms and shared values are that are emerging from the UN system. So in that sense, even though they're not binding, they tell us something about the way the world is running. The second thing is, as you noted, and as hopefully some PhD student will come back and tell us in more detail, they're not expensive. They don't really require a heavy lift from member states. And then when we contrast that to, is it serious to burn this diplomatic capital? It is serious to burn the diplomatic capital in a way that shows us, as you said, what the Trump administration's goal is. It is to break particular parts of this system in ways that render it in the national interest that the Trump administration has formulated for the United States and against the national interest that the US has brought and put on the table for 80 years at the United Nations.
Which leads us directly into a conversation about the Commission on the Status of Women, where these forces and these trends that you just described are playing out in real time. So, just a little bit of background for listeners who might not be as aware, but the Commission on the Status of Women is actually the second largest gathering at the United Nations every year, behind the opening of the UN General Assembly in September. You have thousands of delegates from around the world all coming to the UN for a couple of weeks in March to discuss progress on gender equality, gender rights, formulate ideas and coalitions about how these rights and progress may be advanced even further. That's the idea, at least. And each year, each Commission on Status of Women has its own theme. This year, the theme is Beijing plus 30. Now, that means something to you and I because we're UN nerds, but it's worth unpacking that a little bit. For whatever reason, whenever there's like a consequential UN conference, the UN system has no better way of commemorating it than every 5 years it will rename another conference after it, but add +5 or add +10 or add +20. For example, like in the early 2000s, I was at the Rio +20 conference, which was like a big environmental conference to commemorate another conference 20 years prior. So this year is Beijing plus 30, and it's worth going back to that 1995 Beijing conference, which really was a consequential international conference in the history of the world for the fact that it very firmly and deliberately made women's rights, gender equality central to the UN system. It's most famously known these days for Hillary Clinton's speech, in which she declared that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. So this is like what merged the two, which mainlined gender equality and women's rights into the UN system. And this year's Commission on the Status of Women is intended to review progress towards that ultimate goal and also figure out how we can advance the cause of equality and inclusion and potentially diversity even further, which of course has run afoul with the prime directive of the Trump administration that we discussed earlier.
The Beijing conference was consequential for two big reasons. As you said, the first is the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which generates the benchmarks that they will be revisiting and trying to assess through things like national level reviews that countries submit to sort of mark their progress towards these goals, and then through regional 30-year review processes. The second is, as you said, this incredibly consequential speech, which represents a whole body of thinking about gender rights, women's rights, and human rights in international law. You know, if you listen to Hillary Clinton talk about this in interviews with people who worked with her at the time, there's a series of interviews, for instance, at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, where they talk about the sort of origins of this particular phrase and this particular speech. And it comes on the heels of a movement to essentially say women's rights are not something over there. They're not some secondary goal. Actually, we have a body of law that's primary to the way we think about discrimination, oppression, and systematic subjugation. And that's human rights. And we can't separate those two. So it is a violation, as she says repeatedly in the speech, right? It is a violation of human rights for women to experience things like forced sterilization and domestic violence, right? Is a violation of human rights for women to experience things like the inability to participate in political life as full civic actors. And that framework, I think, is one that necessarily, because it acknowledges the equal rights and dignity of all people, runs afoul of the Trump administration, which has made its calling card the idea that not everybody has the same rights.
And you're seeing that manifest itself in diplomacy at the United Nations over the course of the last several weeks. So in advance of every opening of the CSW, there's a political declaration that, just kind of like outlines the priorities for the CSW. And this year, the United States was trying to upend that process by removing reference to equality in a conference about gender equality.
That's right.
And again, this goes back to the idea that the role that the Trump administration sees itself at the UN is to upend these kinds of negotiations by removing language from documents that have been established for years, if not decades. And we're seeing that play out now.
And it's also not doing so alone, and I think that's critical,
Yep.
right? Much as we see across different arenas in international politics, this constitutes American realignment as opposed to just like a fundamental the US standing alone. It constitutes realignment in this particular case with governments like the Argentine government and the Russian government, which are advocating a very, very firm, hardline conservative perspective on gender equality.
And again, about that realignment, it's really also important to note that the CSW is unique for the fact of its really massive civil society participation.
That's right.
Now,
Yeah.
most civil society that participates in the CSW are there because they want to advance women's rights and they want to see language that has already been adopted progress even further, be more inclusive, be more like gender sensitive, and just expand the pie of rights that are there that we're talking about. There are, it should be said, a number of conservative civil society groups,
Yeah.
mostly based around like religion, conservative interpretations of religion, that also see the CSW as an opportunity to pull back on a lot of those rights, to halt progress, and to redefine women's rights around more traditional religious conservative values. And so there is often at this conference like a tension between those two groups. However, like the progressives that want to expand are a much bigger slice of civil society than the traditionalists. But now you see the United States aligning with Russia, with Argentina under Milei, with groups like the more Muslim conservative countries to try to halt progress, or in some places, even in the case of the US, remove language that had already been added.
And in particular, so Colin Lynch reports this at DevX, but in particular, like one of the places that this appeared most clearly is closed door negotiations around the political declaration to emerge from the Commission on the Status of Women. In particular, the US's proposal was to weaken or abandon provisions that encourage member states and UN bodies to expand the role of women in peacekeeping and diplomacy, to select a woman for the Secretary General's position, and to try and achieve gender parity at the United Nations in terms of its hiring. And the US official, he reports, says that candidates should not be selected based on sex, but only if qualified. So the urge, as Colin Lynch reports, is to have candidates water down the language that encourages member states to nominate a woman for the next Secretary General's position. And this is consequential in part because we're coming up on the next election of the UN Secretary General, and the US and Russia together are more than capable of blocking any candidate. So this isn't just a kerfuffle about language. This is a kerfuffle about actual appointments.
Now, it's worth just emphasizing that because CSW, as I said earlier, is just like very much a civil society conference, there's still like a lot is going to happen. Coalitions will be launched and built. Progress will nonetheless be made. So it's not as if the new Trump administration is like killing the CSW. No, it still will survive and thrive, and good things will happen. However, I did want to point out one thing. So if listeners are inspired to research more about CSW and what's going on this year at the 69th CSW, they will discover that the Commission on the Status of Women this year is led by a Saudi Arabian man.
Yes.
So it's worth unpacking that a little bit and explaining how that is, which to me points to one of the key deficiencies of the United Nations system. So here goes my attempt to explain away why and how the Commission on Status of Women is led by a Saudi Arabian man. So, the commission has a certain number of members. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, 40 something. Anyway, the head of it rotates among regions, and there are like 5 regions in the UN, and this year it was Asia's turn. Now, what happens in situations like this more often than not is that the region colludes amongst itself to nominate a single candidate that they all vote for, so that there is no competing candidate that other countries can vote for. And because of the convention that the leadership rotates among each region, really the region itself has the sole ability to pick the leader. And for whatever reasons, they decided, the Asia Pacific region decided, we want Saudi Arabia to lead the Commission on the Status of Women. And really, like Europe, Latin America, they didn't have much of a say. The rest of the world didn't have a say. This was governments of the region making this decision for everyone else.
It's 45 members.
I was right. I said 40 something.
Yeah, right.
I thought it was like mid 40s.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it is, I think, a key flaw of, if you want a body to be representative, and if geographic representation overrides all other imperatives, you are going to end up in situations where a less than desirable actor is going to end up at the helm of something.
Mm-hmm.
That's often what people say about like UN Human Rights Council, right? You're going to end up with human rights abusers on the Human Rights Council by necessity because of the way the voting is structured. I will say that even among the annals of like geographic representation being cardinal, a Saudi Arabian man being at the helm of the Commission on the Status of Women this year is, again, it's one of those things where if an early 2000s TV writer proposed it, people would be like, okay, come on, ease up a little bit.
Yeah.
Over-determining.
So earlier this week, there was a meeting on Afghanistan at the Security Council. And in advance of that meeting, a number of countries put forth a, quote, joint statement on behalf of Denmark, France, Greece, Guyana, Panama, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom on women, peace, and security in Afghanistan. You'll notice what country I did not mention. And all these countries, I should say, are current members of the Security Council. And they are members of the, quote, shared commitments on women, peace, and security. They're co-signatories to that, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. But you'll notice that the United States did not sign on to this statement affirming women's rights in Afghanistan. Before we get into why that is, Anjali, can I just have you take us back in time and explain the concept of women, peace, and security, which has been a guiding force at the Security Council for nearly 2 decades now?
Over 2 decades, actually. So we're at the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Conference. We are at the 25th year of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, beginning with the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000. Security Council Resolution 1325 is the first one to specifically mention the impact of conflict on women. And essentially what it does is it acknowledges the disproportionate impact and the unique impact of armed conflict on women and girls. It calls for women's perspectives to be adopted at every level of conflict resolution and conflict conduct. So it calls on the UN Security Council and the UN's member states to consider the special needs of women and girls during conflict, during demobilization, repatriation, and resettlement, during reintegration, and during post-conflict reconstruction. It has paid specific attention to the role of women in peace negotiations as well. So it calls for representation of women and women's perspectives at the negotiating table as conflict is going to be sort of drawing to a close. And that resolution requires parties to a conflict to prevent the violation of women's rights, to support women's participation in peace processes and in post-conflict reconstruction, and to protect women and girls from sexual violence and conflict. And in that context, it is the organizing framework for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, which essentially seeks to help member states and the UN advance the different components of 1325. It is the sort of grandmother resolution to a whole body of international law that recognizes the disproportionate impact and the unique impact that conflict processes have on women and calls for their full representation in trying to broker the ends of conflict.
It is just worth emphasizing how impactful and important that this resolution was and continues to be to this day. Women, peace, and security. It was the organizing principle around which, as you said, so many things have flown in the last quarter century. And it still remains in force today. And it guides just a lot of the work of the Security Council.
That's right.
And, members of the Security Council, if they so choose, sign on to be, voluntarily, implementers of this agenda. They say, these members of the Security Council, we want to uphold these commitments that we have made over the years towards women, peace, and security, see them advanced and iterated upon in every successive Security Council debate whenever possible. Until last year, the U.S. signed on to be a member of this Committee on Shared Commitments. They're just called shared commitments. There's not actually the committee word. It's sort of an informal grouping. But now you saw in this meeting on Afghanistan, where there is no more important issue than women's rights and gender equality, the United States did not sign on to this shared commitment. The U.S. issued its own statement, but it again demonstrated to the world that for the Trump administration, gender equality is not something to be upheld, but something to be targeted at the United Nations.
It's interesting because actually, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is the rare gender-facing set of commitments that might be a good place for the Trump administration to do some work, in the sense that there's nothing in the resolution that's immediately antithetical to even all of the executive orders that the Trump administration has handed down. The Women, Peace, and Security agenda is so influential. Let's leave aside whether or not, member states have met the goals outlined in 1325, because they have not, right? But the rhetorical framework is so powerful that the first Trump administration passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act with broad bipartisan support, including from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, including from National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. So because of the nature of the Women, Peace, and Security Act, because of the nature of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, what this body of international commitments does, it is actually advances the idea that there is a difference between men and women. In that sense, it is different than diversity, equity, and inclusion models, because there's nothing about diversity, equity, and inclusion in this platform that runs counter to the idea that men and women are different. And we know that that's like a core principle of the Trump administration's idea about the world. Men and women are different. That's great, say the framers of 1325. We think men and women are different too. And because of the slow nature of international commitments, gender at the United Nations largely does fall along a binary. There isn't a whole body of international law about people who might not fall into the categories women and men. And so at its face, there's nothing antithetical to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda from the perspective of what the Trump administration has been advocating. Kathleen McInnes at CSIS had a little bit of rundown where she tried to sort of square the circle and say, actually, I think these two things could work together. I think the Women, Peace, and Security Act at the domestic level is probably something that Pete Hegseth could run with. But it seems very clear that that's not what they've decided to do at the Security Council. They have decided to essentially say, I'm sorry, anything that says women should be equally represented at a table as men, off the table for us.
So I guess big picture question to you, Anjali, what does it mean for the future of the United Nations if the United States is now striking at this core fundamental element of what the United Nations has done and organized around, both we're talking about for the last 30 years, around gender equality and gender inclusion stemming from the 1995 Beijing Declaration Platform of Action, that Hillary Clinton speech that human rights are women's rights on the one hand, and on the security side of things is seemingly indifferent to the women, peace, and security agenda. I mean, these are our two just like massive organizing principles of how the UN has operated for the last, 30, 25 years. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, I guess some of it depends on how much diplomatic attention and capital the Trump administration wants to put together to actually break these things, because there is widespread diplomatic support for them in other parts of the world. The US alone can't break everything with a big hammer, even though it's trying. And in that sense, the fact that these are normative commitments that matter a lot to other states means that people will probably go to bat for them. That doesn't, as we've talked about before, necessarily mean that they can counteract every place that the US tries to break something or that the US tries to defund. If we were thinking sort of like, what can the US affect most directly and most clearly, is probably personnel appointments. That's probably the place where the US can exercise the most direct influence in snarling up the works of both these agendas. And so with that in mind, right, this is, as we said at the top of the discussion, we're in choosing a new Secretary General mode. The widespread consensus of most other states was that the next Secretary General should be a woman, and should be a woman with commitments to things like gender parity. That is a place where we should expect to see the US try and throw up a bunch of roadblocks, not just try and throw up a bunch of roadblocks, but because the consent of the US is critical to appointing the next Secretary General, we should expect the US's preferences to shape the process of trying to select a next Secretary General. So the race now looks very different than it did last year.
Yeah.
There's never been a woman Secretary General. I actually don't even know if that means that we won't see a woman Secretary General. But I do think it means that if we do see one, it will be someone who is aligned in meaningful ways to the vision of international politics that the Trump administration has, or at least knows how to talk the talk.
Yeah.
Right?
Or is just like a friend of Trump's, or somehow charms him,
Yeah.
or whatever. He's so capricious.
Ivanka Trump, what are you up to these days?
Oh, God. That wouldn't be so terrible. I mean, maybe it would. Yes, it would. Never mind. I rescind that comment.
I guess our baseline now is terrible compared to what?
Yeah. So, Anjali, earlier we were discussing organizing principles of the United Nations. One of them for the last 10 years has been the Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
And now, out of nowhere, seemingly, the United States is on the record opposing the Sustainable Development Goals. This is wild. It took me by surprise. Let me play for you, for listeners, a short clip of the American delegate. That was a free preview of our full episode. To unlock the episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. We rely on your support to keep this show going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us from Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us from Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.